a people who had recently left Egypt, in the middle of the desert. No city, no temple, no permanent structure. And then God commands, "Build a sanctuary for me," a portable sanctuary, covered in gold, with precise measurements and meticulous details. The question is inevitable. How did a nomadic people manage to build the tabernacle in the desert? Today we will reconstruct this project step by step, based solely on the Bible, revealing how each detail was planned and executed approximately 3,500 years ago, because understanding how the tabernacle was actually built completely changes the way we read Exodus. The setting was Mount Sinai. After crossing the sea and wandering through the desert, Israel had arrived at the foot of the mountain where the covenant would be formalized. In Exodus 24, Moses ascends the mountain enveloped in cloud and glory. There he remains 40 days and 40 nights, not only receiving commandments, but detailed instructions for something completely new in biblical history. For the first time, God commanded the construction of a portable sanctuary, and this was not an improvised altar made of stones, as had occurred in previous instances. Now the instructions included precise measurements, specific types of materials, division of internal spaces, and determined functions for each object. The text of Exodus 25 marks the beginning of a description that spans several chapters, showing that it was not a generic symbolic idea, but a carefully structured project. What is most impressive is the way the instructions are presented. God doesn't just deliver the concept of a place of worship. He provides proportions, defines fabrics, determines thicknesses, specifies metals, and establishes the exact placement of each element. The language is similar to a technical manual. This reveals intention, order, and purpose. While Moses receives these instructions on the mountaintop, the people remain in the camp. They are still learning to live as an organized nation. They have no fixed territory or established urban centers. Even so, they are about to participate in a process that will require coordination, skill, and collective commitment. The question naturally arises: who would execute such a detailed project? Where would the necessary resources come from? How would instructions received on a mountaintop be transformed into a real structure in the middle of the desert? This moment at Sinai was not merely the giving of laws, it was the starting point of a work that would change the spiritual dynamic of Israel. What begins as revelation will become concrete construction, and then comes the next chapter of this story. Where did all the materials needed to make this project possible come from? If you want to follow each step of this construction and understand how this project went from paper to reality in the desert, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and write in the comments which city you are watching from. In the next few minutes, we will reveal details that almost no one notices when reading the book of Exodus. With the instructions already given to Moses on Mount Sinai, the next step was to transform revelation into reality. But there was a clear challenge. Where would the materials for such a detailed construction come from? The tabernacle required gold, silver, bronze, fine fabrics, hides, sturdy wood, oil, spices, and precious stones. None of these were common in the arid desert environment. The answer begins in Exodus 25, 1-9. God commands Moses to speak to the people so that they may bring voluntary offerings. The text is clear: "From every man whose heart moves him to give willingly." This was not a mandatory tax or forced collection. The contribution should arise from inner disposition. This already reveals something important about the project. It would be built with the conscious participation of the community. The list of materials is detailed. Gold, silver, and bronze would form the metallic base of the sanctuary. Fine linen, blue, purple, and crimson fabric would make up the inner curtains. Animal skins would serve as outer coverings. Acacia wood would be used for the structure and various utensils. Pure oil would fuel the candelabrum. Spices would be used in incense and anointing. Onyx stones and other precious stones would adorn the priestly garments. But how did a people living as nomads possess such resources? The Exodus narrative itself provides the key. In Exodus 12:35-36, before leaving Egypt, the Israelites asked the Egyptians for silver, gold, and clothing. The text states that the Lord caused them to find favor in the eyes of the Egyptians, and so they left with riches. What seemed like just a detail of the liberation now reveals itself to be part of a larger preparation. The materials did not originate in the desert. They were brought from Egypt. What had been a symbol of oppression would be transformed into an instrument of worship. The gold that could have represented foreign luxury would now be used to build a sanctuary dedicated to the God who liberated the people. Another practical aspect needs to be considered. Israel had no mines, industrial workshops, or structured commercial centers in the desert. They used what they already had. This shows that the project did not depend on sophisticated urban infrastructure, but on the mobilization of what was available. Exodus 35 expands on this scenario. When Moses gives the order to the people, men and women bring their offerings. The text describes how all whose hearts were willing contributed with jewelry, fabrics, wood, and skills. At a certain point, the donations were so abundant that Moses had to order them to stop bringing more materials, as there was already enough for the work. This detail is significant. The tabernacle was not built out of reluctant scarcity, but with collective generosity. The motivation was not ostentation, but participation in something that represented God's presence in their midst. Acacia wood, for example, was found in the Sinai region. Resistant and durable, it became the structural basis of the sanctuary and its utensils. The fine fabrics were probably brought from Egypt, where the textile industry was developed. Knowledge of dyeing and embroidery may also have been acquired during years of interaction with Egyptian culture. Thus, what Israel experienced as a period of slavery was also a time of technical learning. Many had worked in construction, metallurgy, and crafts. What had previously served an empire would now serve a sacred purpose. It's important to understand that the project didn't just fall from the sky. It required organization. Offers needed to be collected, sorted, and distributed. Materials were separated according to their purpose. Metals would be melted down, fabrics sewn, wood cut and fitted. All of this demanded planning. Analyzing this initial stage, we understand that the tabernacle began with an internal movement of the people. Before any hammer or tool, there was a voluntary decision. The construction was born from a calling and a response. The biblical text does not romanticize the process. It shows people bringing what they had. Some contributed precious metals, others threads and fabrics, still others manual skills. Each element was important in the final result. What's most impressive is realizing that nothing was improvised. God had given the specifications. The people provided the resources. Now the stage was set for the next phase, transforming raw materials into a functional structure. But a new, inevitable question arises. If the materials were already available and organized, who possessed the necessary skills to execute such a complex project in the middle of the desert? With the materials gathered and organized, the next challenge was no less significant: transforming resources into structure. Gold needed to be melted and molded. Fabrics had to be woven, dyed, and embroidered. Wood had to be cut with precision. It wasn't enough to have raw materials. Technical knowledge was necessary. It is at this point that Exodus 31 introduces two names that become central to the execution of the project: Bezalel and Oholiab. The text states that God filled them with skill, intelligence, and knowledge to work with gold, silver, bronze, stone cutting, and wood carving. The description does not suggest improvisation, but specific training for each stage of the work. Bezalel, from the tribe of Judah, is presented as the main person in charge. Oholiab, from the tribe of Dan, he acts as his direct collaborator. Together, they would coordinate the work of the other artisans. This organization reveals something important. The tabernacle was not built by Moses alone, nor by a small, isolated group. It was the result of structured leadership and collective cooperation. Exodus 35 expands on this picture. The text states that everyone who was skilled and whose heart moved them to work approached the work. Men and women participated actively. Some women, for example, spun the fabric with their own hands. Others cut wood, smelted metals, and prepared specific pieces. The project took on a communal scale. There was a division of labor. While some produced fixed structures, others crafted priestly garments. Every detail followed the model received by Moses on the mountain. There was no room for creative alterations outside of the original instructions. This coordination in the desert demonstrates advanced planning. It was necessary to establish work areas, use separate tools, organize a schedule, and maintain control over the materials already delivered. The biblical text does not describe every logistical step, but the very complexity of the work indicates that there was careful management. Another relevant point is that the skill of these artisans did not arise from nothing. During their years in Egypt, many Israelites worked in construction and technical activities. That experience, although lived under oppression, was now redirected. What previously served the pharaoh's structure began to serve a completely different purpose. But there is an additional element emphasized by the text. The training was not merely technical, it was spiritual. Exodus states that God placed wisdom in the hearts of the craftsmen. This suggests that the execution of the project was not seen as a common activity, but as sacred service. As the hands worked, there was an awareness that each piece had meaning. The measurements could not vary. The colors were not chosen based on personal preference. The proportions had to correspond exactly to the revealed pattern. This balance between human organization and divine guidance is striking. The people provided resources. Artisans applied their knowledge. Leaders coordinated. But everything was subject to a pre-established model. With the workers mobilized and the tasks distributed, the construction began to take shape. Wood ceased to be just logs. Gold ceased to be just raw metal. Fabrics ceased to be loose threads. The project began to materialize before the community's eyes. And then comes the next crucial stage of this story. What was the first structural part assembled? How was the tabernacle physically erected in the middle of the desert? With the craftsmen at work and the materials prepared, construction progressed to its most visible stage, the formation of the tabernacle's physical structure. Exodus 26 presents the sequence of elements that made up this portable sanctuary, revealing that nothing was done randomly. The structural base was formed by acacia wood planks. Each plank had specific measurements and was covered in gold. They were positioned vertically side by side, forming the walls of the sanctuary. At the bottom, they fit into silver bases, which gave stability and firmness to the whole. Transverse bars passed through rings fixed to the planks, keeping everything aligned and reinforced. This system allowed for something essential: assembly and disassembly. The tabernacle was not a fixed structure. It needed to be transported whenever the people moved. The pieces were made to fit together and come apart precisely, preserving the original shape with each new installation. Above this inner structure came the curtains. First, a set of 10 curtains of fine twisted linen, adorned with cherubs embroidered in blue, purple, and crimson threads. These curtains formed the inner lining, creating the sacred space that separated the common area from the consecrated space. Above these, another layer was placed, curtains of goat hair, offering additional protection. Over this second layer came sheepskins dyed red, and finally, a resistant outer covering, protecting against the intense sun and harsh desert weather. The whole thing functioned as a system of insulation and preservation. Inside, the space was divided by a thick veil, also made of fine linen and embroidered with cherubim. This veil separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies. It was not merely a decorative partition. It represented a clear boundary between areas of restricted access and even more restricted access. The holy place would house specific furnishings, while the Holy of Holies contained the central element of the sanctuary. And this internal organization showed progression, from the outermost area to the innermost, from the common to the most sacred. The entrance to the tabernacle also had a special curtain, supported by columns with bronze bases and gold capitals. Each material had a structural and symbolic function, but the text primarily emphasizes its precision. What's impressive is realizing that everything followed precise measurements. Length, width, and height were clearly defined. Symmetry was not optional. The alignment of the pieces had to match the pattern revealed in the pile. This attention to detail reveals that the tabernacle was not merely a functional shelter. Its architecture communicated order and purpose. Every joint, every bar, and every curtain was part of a coherent whole. When erected, the sanctuary became the visual center of the encampment. Around it, the tribes organized themselves according to their designated positions. Thus, the very layout of the people reflected the centrality of that space. And then, an inevitable question arises. Why were all these measurements so detailed? What made each proportion so important within this project revealed thousands of years ago. If you're noticing how every detail in the Bible carries purpose and depth, subscribe to the channel now, because here we don't just skim the Bible, we delve into the details. Like this video so that more people can discover the richness of the scriptures, and write in the comments, did you imagine that the tabernacle was so structured and precise? Your participation strengthens this project and helps to spread the word of God even further. With the structure assembled and the interior space defined, the tabernacle was not yet complete. An empty building did not fulfill its purpose. It was necessary to position, in their specific places, the objects that would give meaning to that carefully prepared environment. The first element described in the instructions was the Ark of the Covenant, placed in the Holy of Holies. As we have already seen in our specific study on the Ark, it represented the center of the covenant between God and Israel. The tablets of the law were kept there, and upon it was the mercy seat, where the annual atonement took place. Its position in the innermost space showed that the heart of the sanctuary was the covenant. In the anterior compartment, the holy place, three objects comprised the environment of continuous service. To the right was the table of the showbread. Made of acacia wood and overlaid with gold, it held 12 loaves of bread, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. These loaves were renewed weekly. The table indicated constant provision and reminded the people that they were always before God. To the left was the pure gold candelabrum, crafted from a single piece of gold. Unlike the other coated utensils, it was molded entirely from beaten gold. Its 7 lamps were to remain lit continuously, fueled with pure olive oil. In an enclosed space without windows, the light of the candelabrum was essential. It illuminated the priestly service and symbolized direction amidst the darkness. In front of the veil that separated the two spaces stood the altar of incense. Also made of acacia wood overlaid with gold, it received the daily burning of aromatic incense. The smoke rose continuously, marking the rhythm of the priestly activities. The incense was not lit haphazardly. There was a specific formula and defined times. This reinforced that even the aroma was part of the ordained plan. In the outer courtyard, before the main entrance to the tabernacle, stood the altar of sacrifice. Unlike the interior furnishings, it was covered in bronze, a material more resistant to intense heat. Animal sacrifices were offered there according to the instructions in Leviticus. The altar was the first element seen by those approaching. Before any access to the interior, there was the acknowledgement of the need for atonement. Between the altar and the entrance to the tabernacle was the bronze basin, used for the purification of the priests. Before performing any function within the sanctuary, it was necessary to wash hands and feet. And the sequence was clear: sacrifice, purification, service. When we observe all these objects together, we realize that there was a logical progression in the space. From the exterior to the interior, the path led from sacrifice to presence. Nothing was placed randomly. Each piece occupied a strategic position within a defined order. It is important to note that these objects were not merely decorative. They had daily use. Priests lit lamps, changed bread, offered incense, and performed sacrifices continuously. The tabernacle was an active center of religious service, not a static monument. Furthermore, the materials varied according to function. Gold predominated in interior spaces, associated with more restricted service. Bronze appeared in the atrium, exposed to public activities. This material distinction reinforced the transition between environments. The arrangement of the furnishings showed that the purpose of the tabernacle was not to impress visually, but to organize the relationship between God and the people within a clear system. Each object contributed to this purpose. When everything was in place, the sanctuary finally reflected the complete design received at Sinai. Structure, divisions, and utensils formed a coherent unity. But something essential was still missing. A building may be finished, the objects organized, and the priests prepared. Yet a crucial question remains. What happened when everything was completed? And that's exactly the moment we're going to follow now. After each plank was fitted, each curtain drawn, and each object placed in its exact position, the decisive moment arrived. The project that had begun atop Mount Sinai now stood before the people as a real structure. But the most important question still remained. What would God's response be to this carefully executed work? Exodus 40 describes the final stage with chronological precision. God instructs Moses on the specific day the tabernacle should be erected, the first day of the first month of the second year after the Exodus from Egypt. This information reveals that approximately 1 year had passed since the Exodus. It was not a rushed construction. It was the result of months of preparation, gathering of materials, and coordinated work. On the appointed day, Moses raises the structure, positions the bases, fits the planks, installs the bars, and extends the curtains according to the revealed model. Then, he places the ark in the Holy of Holies and hangs the veil that separated the rooms. Next, he positions the table, arranges the loaves of bread, installs the lampstand, and lights its lamps. The altar of incense is placed before the veil, and the altar of sacrifice is installed in the courtyard. The basin is positioned between the altar and the entrance. The text repeatedly emphasizes that Moses did everything as the Lord commanded him. This repetition is not accidental. It shows that the success of the work was linked to faithfulness to the instructions. Nothing was altered due to personal preference. The received pattern was followed exactly. After assembly, Moses anoints the tabernacle and all its utensils with consecrated oil, officially setting them apart for sacred use. Aaron and his sons are washed, dressed in specific garments, and consecrated for priestly service. The complete system is now functional, and then comes the most impressive moment of the entire story. Exodus 40:34 states that the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. The manifestation was so intense that Moses could not enter the tent while the cloud remained over it. The text describes a visible phenomenon, perceptible to the entire community. That was the ultimate goal of the project. It wasn't just about building a beautiful or functional structure. It was about preparing a place where God's presence would manifest itself among the people. The cloud was not entirely new. It had already accompanied Israel since their exodus from Egypt, guiding them during the day and appearing as a pillar of fire at night. But now, for the first time, it rested upon a structure built according to divine instruction. The tabernacle became the visible center of divine guidance. When the cloud lifted, the people broke camp and continued their journey. When it remained, Israel stayed in place. The movement of the community came to depend directly on the manifestation over the sanctuary. This completely transformed the dynamics of the people in the desert. The center of the camp was neither political leadership nor military force. It was the presence symbolized in that space. It is significant to note that the text does not describe extravagant human celebration at this moment. The focus is on God's action. The work was completed, but the validation came from above. The glory that filled the tabernacle confirmed that the project had been accepted. The spiritual impact of this event cannot be underestimated. A people who had lived for centuries under foreign rule now possessed a center of worship that symbolized the presence of the God who had liberated them. It was not a fixed stone temple, but a structure that accompanied them every step of the way. This detail is essential. The tabernacle was not restricted to one city. It traveled with the people. The divine presence was not associated with a specific territory, but with the relationship established through the covenant. Throughout the years in the desert, the tabernacle became the focal point for decisions, rituals, and national organization. Its assembly and disassembly required discipline and order. Each tribe had a defined position around it, as described in Numbers 2. The very layout of the camp reflected the centrality of that space. When Israel finally entered the Promised Land, the tabernacle remained the center of worship until the construction of the temple in Jerusalem. The model received at Sinai would directly influence the design of Solomon's temple centuries later. But the moment described in Exodus 40 remains unique. It was the first time that a portable sanctuary, built in the middle of the desert by a newly liberated people, became the official site of the manifestation of divine glory. The impossible project had been completed. The gold brought from Egypt, the wood worked in the desert, the fabrics embroidered by the hands of the people. Everything converged on that moment when the cloud covered the tent. And then comes the final question that spans generations. If the goal was not just the building, but the presence, what does that mean for us today? This reflection leads us to the conclusion of this study on how the Tabernacle of Moses was actually built and why every detail recorded 3,500 years ago remains relevant. As we reconstruct the construction of the tabernacle step by step, we realize that it was never just a tent in the desert. It was a divinely planned project, and executed with precision and confirmed by the very manifestation of God's glory. Every material, every measurement, and every function pointed to a greater truth. God desired to dwell in the midst of his people. The tabernacle was born in an unlikely setting. A newly liberated people, without a fixed territory, organized resources, skills, and collective effort to erect a portable sanctuary. The gold came from the hands that had left Egypt. The wood was prepared in the desert itself. The fabrics were worked by willing men and women. Nothing was improvised, but also nothing fell ready-made from the sky. There was human participation aligned with divine guidance. The structure revealed order. The objects indicated purpose. The altar reminded of the need for atonement. The basin pointed to purification. The candelabrum illuminated the continuous service. The table of bread symbolized constant provision. The altar of incense represented communion. And at the center of it all, in the Holy of Holies, was the Ark of the Covenant, a sign of the covenant established at Sinai. But the culminating point wasn't the architecture. It was the moment when the cloud covered the tent and the glory of the Lord filled it. This makes it clear that the goal was never the building itself. The purpose was the presence. The tabernacle shaped all of subsequent biblical history. Its model influenced Solomon's temple. Its principles structured the sacrificial system described in Leviticus. Its organization taught that the relationship with God involves reverence, order, and commitment. When we study this ancient project, we are not merely analyzing desert engineering. We are observing how God chose to reveal himself in a concrete way at a specific moment in history. The portable sanctuary showed that the divine presence was not limited to empires, palaces, or grand monuments. It walked with the people. Perhaps that is the great lesson of the tabernacle. God was not seeking a monumental construction to impress neighboring nations. He established a space where the people could learn about holiness, forgiveness, and closeness. Now we want to hear from you. What detail surprised you most about the construction of the tabernacle? Did you imagine it was so complex and organized? If this study deepened your understanding of the Bible, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell to follow our future content. Here we explore every detail of the scriptures with clarity and faithfulness, because knowing biblical history strengthens our faith and draws us closer to God's promises.